Okay, so welcome to our weekly workshop. During this workshop, we're going to be talking about legal and ethical issues related to cybersecurity, and most of this is going to be using case studies. So I have some case studies, and you know, we'll talk through those, and then I'll you know, what I suggest for teachers who are going to do this kind of thing in class, and I certainly encourage you that you do, but for teachers who are going to do this kind of thing, you know, I suggest that you, you know, come up with your own case studies that are perhaps more relatable to your students. So some of the things we're going to talk about are things that you'll remember. You know, the teachers are going to remember this stuff, but students may not have sufficient context to talk about it in detail. But I'll talk about some ways that we can approach getting this discussion going. You know, so maybe you don't have to rely on the students' historical knowledge. You can make them do a little bit of research beforehand. Before we get into that, I'll just start with my weekly commercial overview. Tuesdays at 1 p.m. We do these live, and I think most of the traction comes out of the folks who look at the recordings later on. So you can fast forward through stuff that is less interesting, like this slide maybe. And I'll clean this slide up a little bit for next time. So this is the same slide I've shown at each workshop. Some recent news that I think is worth taking a look at. And the top one here is, and this, I'm going to sort of tie this news directly to our discussion today. The top story here is off of pbs.org. And it's, so in a crash, should self-driving cars save passengers or pedestrians? 2 million people weigh in. And so this is a story about a study that's been ongoing at MIT for a couple of years, where they have this website, and I'm going to pull up the website. So the news story is the first link. And if you pull up this link, it's, you get a bunch of ads, of course, but it talks about since 2016, MIT has had this moral machine platform running, and it's a little game that you play, and you basically, and again, I'm going to show it to you, but you decide what the self-driving car should do in different scenarios. You know, should it run over the cat or run over the person, or should it drive into the wall and save the you know, homeless person in the crosswalk? It's, you know, it's these kinds of sort of, you know, manufactured ethical dilemmas. But this is really, I mean, these are really things that as this technology of self-driving cars progresses, there's going to have to be somebody who programs the car to take certain actions in certain situations. And so, you know, the question is, when something bad happens, who's at fault? Is it the occupant of the car? Is it the guy who programmed the car? Is it the car because there's AI that the car is using to decide what to do? You know, so those are sort of ethical questions that I think are useful to get into a discussion with your students. And so here's kind of a typical scenario. You know, what should the self-driving car do? And so here's a self-driving car. It has 3 people in it, and there's a crosswalk with 3 elderly people crossing the road. And so the question is, the car is in a, you know, it's at a point where it can't stop in time. And so the question is, or the brakes failed or whatever, the question is, what should the self-driving car do? Should it run over the 3 elderly people in the crosswalk, or should it intentionally run into the barrier and kill the 3 people in the car? And again, you know, it's sort of manufactured little dilemma, but still, I think sort of interesting to consider. So if you go, so I have the website here to the Moral Machine, http moralmachine.mit.edu, and so when you first go here, you choose your language, and then you know, there's a little movie you're going to watch about self-driving cars, and then you can start judging, right? So there's some instructions you can review, and you can actually create your own scenarios if you want. But I'm gonna I'm going to just, how do I get rid of this darn thing? I'm going to start judging just to show you this. And so here's a scenario. Self-driving car, in this case, is no occupants in the car, or maybe the occupants don't matter. You know, whoever's in the car would survive either way. And so the choice is, should the car go straight and run over the cat and the dog, or should the car, and the cat and the dog are crossing against the red light here, if you notice, or should the self-driving car veer into the pedestrians in the crosswalk that are crossing on a green light? And so you can get a description. In this case, self-driving car with sudden brake failure will swerve and drive through a pedestrian crossing. In the other lane, this will result in a dead female executive, one dead large man. Note that the affected pedestrians are abiding by the law and crossing on the green signal. And then over on the left side, you can get a description of this one too, very similar. Brake failure, car is gonna drive through the intersection, kill a cat and a dog, and note that the affected pedestrians, in this case, not really pedestrians, but pets, are flouting the law by crossing on the red signal, right? So let's say the cars do that. And then it goes on and gives you different scenarios, right? So again, should the car veer into the, jogger who's crossing on a green light, or should the car go straight and run over the person who is crossing against the signal? And you go through, you know, multiple of these scenarios. You know, you sort of choose what to do, and it gives you 13 of them. And then at the end, it gives you a little. It doesn't. You know, it doesn't score you, tell you if you're moral or not. But what it does is it says that you tend to place more value in, and it'll, you know, sort of give your statistics, right? So you place more value in people than you do in pets, or you place more value in, you know, young people than you do in old people. So interesting exercise, I think, to think about, you know, the AI or you know, some decision making that self-driving cars are going to have to do in the future. And, you know, thus far the discussion of self-driving cars has really been about, are they safe enough? You know, so are, you know, we've heard stories of self-driving cars who have, you know, hit people. You know, there's been at least one instance of somebody dying because somebody who's not in a self-driving car, somebody who was, you know, on the side of the road, who died because a self-driving car, you know, ran into her, and the person who was behind the wheel, who was supposed to be paying attention, apparently wasn't paying attention, so wasn't able to hit the brake and cause the car to stop in time. And, you know, but those are straightforward scenarios where the car obviously should avoid the person in the road when you know, the other option is, you know, kill somebody. You know, it's basically binary, kill somebody or not. But, you know, when you get into these scenarios where, you know, there's no clear right answer, it gets a little bit more interesting. Okay, so that's the first news story. Second news story, nobody's cell phone is really that secure. And this is an article in The Atlantic, and it's by Bruce Schneier, who's, if you're not familiar with Bruce Schneier, he's a security professional, written several books on the topic. He's considered probably one of the leading experts in information security. You know, sort of a visionary. He's been, you know, he's written books both on the technical side. So he's written Applied Cryptography, which is a book about cryptographic systems and how to implement those cryptographic systems in different programming languages. And then he also writes books that are more have a spin that's less technical, but more sort of ethical issues or privacy issues or those kinds of things. Anyway, he writes. He has a really good blog, and he writes articles, and he writes books, and he works for I want to say IBM. But he writes, so this story is related to President Trump, who apparently uses he uses a cell phone, and that's, you know, so President Obama did the same thing, right? He had a cell phone that he used, and he did, you know, smartphone that he would make phone calls on and do stuff. And so in this article, Bruce Schneier talks about the insecurity of cell phones. So nobody's cell phone is really that secure, but most of us aren't the president of the United States, right? So he describes a sort of a list of potential vulnerabilities, and they're things that most of us would never really have to worry about. We don't generally we don't have to worry about somebody intercepting our cell phone calls and then doing a man-in-the-middle attack to pass that call on to a cell tower, for example. And that's not going to be done at scale to private individuals that we know of, but certainly if you're targeted for a specific purpose, that technology is available and it can be used, and intelligence agencies do this routinely. And so so who should be concerned about this kind of stuff? And exactly what you'd think, people like the president, or senior ranking government officials, or those kind of people. But this is a good article, largely because because Bruce Schneier talks about the different vulnerabilities that exist in both in telephone handsets, right? So you have Android handsets. You have two sort of basic classifications. You have Android handsets, and then you have iPhones, and there are different levels of security for different reasons. I think the sort of understood case of handset security is that iPhones are much more secure, and that's not necessarily because Apple is particularly good at securing their software, but Apple controls the platform and the software. And when you control the platform and the software, you can you have a very limited number of devices that the software has to work with, and you can very tightly control what the software can do with the platform, which is the phone itself, right? But with Androids, there are thousands of different Android variants, and each Android variant essentially runs its own version of the Android operating system, and they're all slightly different and tweaked by the cell carriers and tweaked by the manufacturers of the handsets. And so you have thousands of different versions of Android out there, and most handsets, the software on most Android handsets is only maintained for about a year. So now there are attempts to put laws in place that require that mobile device operating systems are maintained for at least 2 years, but in most Android handsets, that's not the case. They're maintained for about a year, and then after that, if there are new vulnerabilities, you're not going to get a patch. With iPhone, they're only supporting a handful of different platforms, the different existing versions of the iPhone handset, and so they keep that software update. I have a 3-year-old iPhone, and I just got the latest iPhone software update, a couple of weeks ago. So it's just easier for Apple to keep it secure and to keep the software updated. But it's not only the handsets and the software that have security issues. There's also issues related to the cellular system itself, right? So I mentioned you could potentially eavesdrop on a cellular telephone, or conduct a man-in-the-middle attack on a cellular telephone call, because it's just a radio signal. Of course, it's encrypted, but if you do the right kind of man-in-the-middle attack, then there's a potential to do this thing where you set up an encrypted connection between the handset and the man in the middle, and then you set up another encrypted connection between the man in the middle and the cell tower, so that the handset and the cell tower don't realize that there's somebody in the middle who's actually listening to the conversation or eavesdropping on the network traffic. And again, nation states certainly are in a position to do that kind of thing. So good article, I think. Okay, so that's enough news. So a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago maybe, I thought it might be helpful for folks to throw up some sources of security news. This is the same slide I threw up 3 weeks ago. I'm just going to throw it up again quickly because if you haven't seen it before, you might take a screenshot and then use this later. So it lists some good security news sources on the left, and then Twitter feeds on the right. InfoSec people are Twitter people, so I think there are certain groups of people who are active on Twitter, and I know it's like a thing for celebrities and athletes to do Twitter. It just turns out that InfoSec people are also Twitter people. So there's lots of good Twitter feeds within the InfoSec community. And if you do it right, you can filter your stuff so you only get the InfoSec stuff and not all the other useless garbage. So anyway, news sources and Twitter feeds, but I added to that some InfoSec podcasts. So I'm a bit of a podcast guy. I spend a lot of time on the road driving around the state of Virginia. And so when I'm driving around, I listen to podcasts, and so these are some that I think are pretty good. Security Now, listed at the top there. That's a weekly podcast. It can be up to 2 hours long, but it's recent security news and then some additional context to make that news more useful, I guess is how I describe it. But it's a pretty good, very, very well regarded InfoSec podcast. Second one, SANS Daily Network Security Podcast. This is a daily podcast. It's very brief, but it's and it's really, I guess, mostly intended for InfoSec professionals. So maybe educators wouldn't listen to it so much. I don't really listen. You know, once in a while I pick it up, and if I know of a recent exploit or recent interesting vulnerability that I don't know a lot about, then I'll jump on the SANS Daily Network Security Podcast, and you know, they usually do a podcast on those things like the next day or 2 days later, and you can get sort of the meat and potatoes of those interesting new exploits very quickly. So again, it's only 5 or 10 minutes long. The next one on the list there, unsupervised learning. So that's Daniel Meisler, who's another pretty well-known InfoSec professional. He does this weekly podcast, and he really distills a lot of recent security news into sort of a 30-minute. So it's not a lot of fluff. It's really just pretty well distilled information into a 30-minute podcast every week. Security Weekly, the fourth one on the list there. This is a podcast by Paul Asadorian and some other folks that sort of come and go. He has this group of 6 or 8 different people that join in some weeks and not other weeks, and this is a group that's pretty active on like the HackerCon scene. So you'll see Paul Asadorian and Joe Pesci and I'm trying to think of some of the other folks. A group of people that I'll see them at Black Hat every year. They'll be at DerbyCon and at the different B-Sides events, and so Jack Daniel is another one of the 3 or 4 people who are sort of on this podcast most weeks, and then there's some other people that come and go. But so this is 1 to 2 hours every week. It can be sort of not safe for work. Sometimes they don't use a lot of profanity, but they'll talk about drinking too much at a conference, or things that maybe your high school kids wouldn't, maybe you wouldn't want to expose them to it. But it's but they have, they'll have people come in from different security vendors, and they'll sort of grill them on their security tools, and it's pretty good. They usually have in and amongst the other stuff, they usually have a really good discussion about recent things going on in the InfoSec community. And then the last one, Risky Business, is so that's a 1 hour weekly. I've only listened to it a couple times. My recollection is that it's pretty good. Pretty well distilled, useful information, not a lot of fluff. But I add that to the list as well. I'll say Security Weekly, the fourth one there, is a lot of good content, but also a lot of fluff. These guys just kind of shooting the breeze for parts of it, and unless you have time to waste, that part of it is not particularly useful. Okay, so podcasts again. Security InfoSec people are podcast people, so this is a good way to, if you spend a lot of time in a car, this is a good way to kind of stay, or if you get on the treadmill or whatever, good way to get some InfoSec news where you don't have to spend time on a website. Okay, so today is Ethics and cybersecurity education. So this is directly from the Cyber Basics course in the course repository, Module 5, Legal and Ethics, Lesson 2, Case Studies, Cybersecurity Law, Ethics, and Privacy. So I just pulled the slide deck straight out of there, and that's what I'm going to use today. What I would, once I go through this, you'll probably get some ideas on how to use this content in the class. The way I'm going to present it is the way I sort of do it at Gen Cyber camps with high school teachers, but that's kind of the way I would approach it with students. Also, if I was doing this with a group of students, what I would suggest for you teachers is to, before you use this in class, think about any recent legal or ethical issues that you might use as case studies. So this is really a series of case studies. And then I would also ask students, if you're going to use this, even after you add your own case studies, I would sort of throw it out and say, okay, what topics might you add to this list, kind of a thing. And actually, I was just having a chat with my daughter yesterday, who's in AP Computer Science Fundamentals course in high school in Virginia, and she has an assignment where she has to select a recent advancement in computing, and then sort of talk about pros and cons from all angles. And so that's one way you could approach this kind of an assignment or a discussion. And then I guess the idea is that students will pick different things, and then the group will come together and talk about these different developments and the pros and cons. Okay, so let me find my other slides. Okay, so that was a 25-minute buildup. All right, here we go. Cybersecurity, law, ethics, and privacy. A couple of learning objectives. Students should be able to identify aspects of cyberspace that might give rise to ethical dilemmas and legal uncertainty, and then examine the competing priorities that are often inherent in cyber-related scenarios. So this is so again, series of case studies, but I start with this slide, and I think it's helpful to sort of set the context of the case studies. So the first bullet here: technology is moving faster than the legal system, and I think that's always been the case, right? So anytime there's a new technology that's introduced, it always takes a while for the laws to catch up. And historically, technology moved at a slower pace, and so you'd have this period where the laws weren't quite catching up, but generally it wouldn't take long. The laws would catch up, and then the technology would go on, relatively unchanged for a long time. And if you think of like traffic laws, right? Cars started becoming popular in the early 1900s, there was concerns about the speed of cars. So there were, in some places, there were laws that said the car could only, couldn't drive faster than 10 miles an hour because you couldn't go faster than a trotting horse, or it would be too dangerous. There were laws that said you couldn't drive a car unless you had somebody walking in front of the car to warn people that the car is coming. So you had this new technology, and then you had some interesting reactions to the new technology. But I think pretty quickly there were some clear traffic laws, right of ways on certain types of intersections, different signage that would be used to, whatever, stop signs, yield signs, et cetera, speed limits, and those laws probably solidified, I don't know, maybe in the 30s and 40s, and that's essentially remained, most of that stuff has remained largely unchanged, for the last, 70 or 80 years. But with the advancements in technology, that's just not the case anymore. Things happen too fast, and by the time the laws catch up, the technology has sort of moved on in many cases. So technology moving faster than the legal system. Second bullet there, network packets traverse state and international borders in unpredictable ways. Okay, so why is that relevant? Well, so students who have taken high school civics classes, for example, they probably understand the difference between state laws and federal laws, right? So if a crime happens in a certain jurisdiction, then there's a local police department or sheriff or whoever who is responsible for enforcing the laws in that jurisdiction. But if a crime occurs that crosses state borders, then all bets are off, right? So now the jurisdictional issue is a federal jurisdictional issue, not a state jurisdictional issue. So now you've elevated the generally elevated the severity, and you've changed who's going to investigate and how they're going to be prosecuted and et cetera. And so that's the same with international borders as well. And it's actually more of a concern with international borders. And an example I'll use is, if you recall, in the late 80s, the U.S. Launched a bombing mission against Libya, against Muammar Gaddafi, and I think it was, I'm pretty sure it was Gaddafi in Libya. Late 80s, President Reagan, I believe, maybe it was Bush, they launched this attack for whatever reason, I don't recall the whole story, but going to bomb Libya, right? And so they were launching aircraft from the UK, and they had to fly over several countries to get to Libya. And before they did that, they had to get permission from each one of those, from the airspace, from each country through which the aircraft are going to fly, because they were going to conduct an offensive military mission against another country. And so the US had to get approval from each country over which these aircraft are going to fly. And the French said, no, you can't do that. You can't fly through our airspace to attack another country. And so of course, the attack still happened, but they had to fly a different route, longer distance to avoid French airspace. And if they would have flown through France to conduct this thing, then the French could have, there's international law that says, you can't do that without the permission of the country involved. And so in the case of the airplanes, it was easy for the US to take care of that, fly around France, right? Now in cyberspace, things are different, right? If we're going to conduct a cyber attack against another country, you don't know the route through which those network packets are gonna take to reach their target. The internet is designed to route packets on the most efficient route, and there's really no practical way to specify the route that the packets will take. So if I conduct a cyber attack against Libya from the UK, and I can't control the countries through which those packets traverse, am I violating international law by doing that? If other countries say, no, you can't attack through us. So I think that's just one example of one of the repercussions of the fact that network packets, traverse borders in unpredictable ways. Another example of that is the fact that, you don't know where your packets are going to go, so your packets may end up going through a country that is hostile to you or to your allies. And so if the packets are traveling through that country, then that provides an opportunity for eavesdropping, right? So that country could intercept all those packets along the way and then try to decrypt them if they're encrypted, or read the traffic if it's not encrypted. And there are actually instances where there's one specific instance that's pretty well known from, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, where a major portion, something like 25% of all worldwide network traffic was improperly routed through a specific region in China. And that was based on misconfigured routing equipment in China. And so so the fact that this was happening was discovered, and a lot of people pointed fingers at the Chinese and said, hey, how come you're purposely routing all this traffic through your infrastructure. And the Chinese said, oh, it wasn't purposeful. It was an error. Some engineer misconfigured some routing equipment, and so it sort of turns in this debate where you pointing fingers at each other. But again, you have this unpredictable traffic routing, and that can cause different issues. And then, so this takes us right to the third bullet, right? Attribution of cyber attacks can be extremely difficult. It's hard to point the finger at the party who actually conducted the attack. So in this case, if you say, okay, we point the finger at China and say, hey, you purposely did this thing, and the Chinese say, no, we didn't. It was an accident. It was not malicious. It was a mistake. But it's hard to go back and prove that they did the wrong thing on purpose. But the same is true with a bank gets hacked, for example, and there's always this investigation to try to tie that activity back to some individual or some group or some country, and it's not only extremely difficult, but it's also the case that many attackers will place essentially false evidence to misattribute cyber attacks, right? So, maybe the Chinese will put in a bunch of Russian words in their malware, or, there's even cases where attribution has been done by saying, well, we know that this activity happens between this hour and this hour, and that's like the standard workday in Moscow, and so it must be the Russians who are conducting this attack. And of course, the Russians come back and say, well, it wasn't us, and anybody could do that. Anybody could just change the hours that they're conducting the attack. So attribution is extremely difficult. It's certainly not impossible, and there are companies that are actually very good at it. So CrowdStrike, for example, is a company that sort of part of their business is based on very carefully attributing the parties that conduct different cybersecurity, different offensive cyber operations, different hacking operations, and but still, just because everybody sort of knows that attribution is so hard, even though you have a company that's very good at it and is usually, they can usually make the case very well, countries just sort of say, well, it wasn't us, and people say, well, the Chinese say it wasn't them, and we know that attribution is hard, so we'll never prove it to anybody's satisfaction. So that has effects on the ethics and laws of cybersecurity. Fourth bullet there, the line between cyber espionage and cyber attack is blurred. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, so we know what espionage and attack is in sort of a historical international sense. Espionage is where you spy on other countries, governments, or it's generally nation state spying on the activities of another nation state, and the international law surrounding that is pretty nuanced, right? So there are some cases where some situations where espionage is clearly illegal. So if you're breaking and entering to conduct espionage, for example, that's you're violating some law somewhere. So you could point to that and say, well, this person is breaking the law. But some espionage is not illegal. It's so if you're sitting outside in a cafe watching people going in and out of the embassy and recording who goes in and out when, then there's no law being broken. That's sort of simple espionage, and so no harm, no foul, and countries do that to each other all the time. Cyber attack, on the other hand, is always wrong. I mean, it's always wrong. Maybe not always wrong, but it's always a violation of, if you attack somebody without provocation, that's always going to be a violation of international law. And so now, if you get into cyberspace, what is espionage and what is cyber attack? And a lot of nation state intelligence agencies conduct essentially offensive cybersecurity operations against other countries. They'll break into systems. They won't steal anything, so they won't remove any intellectual property. They won't damage any data. They won't do anything except for eavesdrop on communications. And they'll say, oh, that's just espionage, and that's sort of become something that is that is recognized as espionage. And so countries do it all the time, and there's sort of this understood, hey, we were just, you know, we were just spying on you like we do, and so now we'll stop because we got caught, and it doesn't turn into an international incident. The question is, where's the line between espionage and attack? When is one of these operations an attack rather than just conducting espionage? And so if you think of the hacks of the DNC, the Democratic National Convention email system in 2016, you had all these, emails that were taken, and then they were shared in different places to the detriment of the Democratic National Party. And so, did that cross the line between espionage and attack? And again, this is perhaps a situation where the laws haven't quite caught up, and so I don't know. I think that's useful to talk with students about. Then the last two bullets there are related to encryption. So the first one, or I should say the fifth bullet here, encryption can and will prevent law enforcement from accessing important digital evidence. And we will look at a case study related to that. Okay, so we've already seen this, right? We've seen cases where people's cell phones, where people have conducted a crime, their cell phones have been locked and encrypted, and law enforcement has asked for those cell phones to be decrypted so that they can review the data on the phone, and people have refused. And so now you can point to that and you can say, well, encryption is preventing law enforcement from doing its job properly. And we'll talk about a specific case study along those lines. Here's an interesting fact that most folks don't know. If your mobile device is encrypted, so if you have a passcode on your iPhone, for example, law enforcement cannot serve a warrant that requires you to put in your passcode to unlock the device, but they can serve you a warrant that requires you to use your thumbprint or other biometric to unlock the device, because it basically comes down to knowledge versus a physical trait, right? So a search warrant can't require you to give knowledge that could be self-incriminating, like the 4-digit passcode on your phone, but they can force you to use your thumb to open the phone, because you're not imparting any knowledge that could be detrimental to your Fifth Amendment rights. Again, little known fact that a lot of folks don't, a lot of criminals don't know, which is probably good, but a lot of others don't know either. Okay, and then the last bullet. So the last bullet is sort of in direct competition with the fifth bullet, right? Our digital economy, as well as personal privacy, relies on effective encryption technology. So on the one hand, we're saying that our digital economy, I mean, essentially the US banking system is built on encryption. Without encryption, we could not have a digital banking system. And so that encryption needs to be as secure as we can possibly make it, or our economy could suffer grave danger if there was some way to subvert it. Okay, but on the other hand, we say that great encryption that we use is used also in other instances that will prevent law enforcement from doing its job. And again, we'll look at case studies that rely on both of those. Okay, so let me dive into a couple of case studies, see how many I get to. First one here is Stuxnet. So Stuxnet is a piece of malware that, again, the teachers will may remember this. Students probably won't, because it happened around 2010. But Stuxnet was malware. This is really clever, actually, and there's a great book by Kim Zetter called Countdown to Zero Day. I'll type it in the chat here. Stuxnet book. Countdown to Zero Day by Kim Zetter. So this is a book about, it tells the whole story of Stuxnet, and there are other, there's some, in the speaker notes for this slide, there's references to some other Stuxnet articles that sort of tell the story. Kim Zetter's discussion of it is really good. It's a book that sort of reads like a spy novel, but it's, this was malware that was surreptitiously placed on centrifuges in an Iranian uranium enrichment facility. And what the malware did was, it was this multiple stage malware, right? So the first thing it did was it very carefully identified exactly what type of systems it was running on. So it had all these checks to ensure that it was running on very specific, type of centrifuge with very specific control software, and it was all these tests to make sure that it couldn't execute the malicious payload unless it was on one of these centrifuges in this facility in Natanz, in Iran. So it went through this whole series of checks, and then what it did was it recorded the proper operation of the centrifuge for a long period of time, and then it started playing back. So it started causing the centrifuges to spin faster and slower. So it would do this cycle where it would spin them too fast and spin them too slow and spin them too fast and spin them too slow. But all the while it was taking this recorded proper operation and it was sending that to the logging system so that it looked to the outside the specific centrifuge, it looked like everything was operating normally. So the operators of the nuclear facility couldn't identify that these things were spinning out of control. But the centrifuges did this crazy dance that essentially caused them to self-destruct over time. These are very finely tuned devices that need to operate at a specific frequency for months to do the right thing. And if you screw around with the way they operate, then that that subverts that whole process, and it caused like thousands of these centrifuges to basically self-destruct. And they traced it back to software that was eventually traced back to the United States, actually. So this was attributed to the United States. Of course, I mentioned that attribution is hard, right? So I don't think anybody in the United States has sort of fessed up, but but basically the National Security Agency was accused of doing this. And so here are some questions for discussion, right? Was this a cyber attack? Was this an act of war? I guess maybe is a better question. Was this an act of military aggression? And there's specific definitions that go along with that definition of an act of war. And basically, we say that an act of war must be an action that kills people or breaks things, right? So if it doesn't kill people or break things, then it's not an act of war. So these sort of routine attacks on the DNC, for example, so, cyber attack purportedly by Russia against the DNC, Democratic National Committee. Some people would point to that and say, "Oh, they're violating our election system, and that's an act of war." And I think just about every international legal scholar would say that's not an act of war. That's certainly an exaggeration. But in this case, these things were damaged, right? These centrifuges were damaged, and so. You could classify this as an act of war by the United States against Iran. Some people would classify it as such. And then, so was this action legal under international law? Is this something that, is this something that if the United States was responsible, should they be punished for it? And then you could get into a separate discussion about was this an ethical? Was this a justified attack? What was the purpose of the facility? What was the motives of the Iranians? And was this if this wasn't an act of war, was it justified? And you can sort of get into the moral ethical discussion with your students. And this is one of those things where there's really no real correct answer. You might come to a conclusion as a class, or you might at least have an interesting debate about motives and who was right and who was wrong. Okay, let me dive into another one here. DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea versus Sony Pictures. This is a little bit more recent. In 2014, a cyber attack on Sony Pictures Entertainment destroyed data on hundreds of computer systems and cost the company millions of dollars. Suspicion was immediately directed to North Korea, who had complained of Sony's upcoming movie, The Interview. So this is a movie about a couple of goofballs who were sent to North Korea, or I don't know, I guess they were going there to film a show or something, and this whole thing's supposed to be a comedy, and they were recruited by the U.S. government to kill Kim Jong-un. And this was, of course, the North Koreans saw this as a sort of blatant slap in the face, and they warned Sony that if this movie was released, there'd be grave consequences, and et cetera, et cetera. And the movie was released anyway, and the North Koreans attacked. This is pretty well attributed to the North Koreans. They hacked Sony Pictures Entertainment and cost the company millions of dollars in damages. And so then you can have the same sort of discussion, right? What was the purpose of the attack? Was it effective? Was it an act of war? Was it justified? And I think you could probably say that, in the end, it probably benefited Sony, because I think The Interview was a bad movie, or it wasn't a movie that was going to do very well at the box office. But the fact that this happened, they probably made their money back in droves, because people wanted to see it, just to see what all the excitement was about. Anyway, worth discussing with students. This maybe is even a better one. February 2016, in the wake of a domestic terrorist attack in San Bernardino, the FBI ordered Apple to unlock an iPhone that belonged to one of the attackers so that potential evidence could be recovered. And you teachers probably remember this well. So this 2016, so just a couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago, I guess. And so what did Apple do? FBI asked Apple to unlock the iPhone. What did Apple do? Well, they said, no, we're not going to do it. And that's what caused the news, right? The fact that they asked Apple to do it was not news. In fact, here's another of those little known pieces of data. The fact is that Apple had done this multiple times before. They had unlocked, they had been asked by the FBI to unlock phones, and they had done it and given the data over to the FBI. But in this case, they refused. And so that's a interesting fact to throw out to the students. Okay, Apple had done this before. All of a sudden, they say no. Why did they say no? What was their motivation, right? And so some people who are cynical might say, well, Apple just did that because they wanted the press out of it. They wanted to be able to say, we protect our users' data, even if those users could be, evil or whatever. So that's how much you can trust us to protect your data. That's what cynics would say. There's a lot of cynics in this case. So that's worth talking about. And actually, if you continue the thread, what happens is Apple refused to unlock the iPhone for what they said were technical reasons and privacy reasons. Turns out that the FBI essentially hired a third-party company to unlock the iPhone, and they got the data off the phone. And but the question is, the second major bullet, or the third major bullet there, if this situation hadn't been resolved before a final ruling, so the data was recovered and given to the FBI before there's a final court decision that said, Apple, you either need to do it or not. And so the question here is, if this hadn't been resolved before that court decision was made, where do we think this would have ended up? Would Apple have been required to do this thing, or would they have been able to fight off the legal action? So this is a case where you have encryption technology that is potentially preventing law enforcement from doing its job. And Apple will say they don't have a master key, right? There's no master key that they could use. And they're right. There isn't a master key, and there shouldn't be a master key, because if there was, what happens if that master key got in the wrong hands? Then everybody's data would be, could potentially be disclosed. So this follows right on that same thread. Compliance, this is a law that was proposed in 2016. The Compliance with Court Orders Act of 2016. So this was defeated in 2016, but it was a bill that would have required companies to place a backdoor in their devices and applications to undermine their own encryption in order to comply with court orders to provide evidence in legal cases. So basically, this was legislators who said, okay, Apple and your friends who make encryption, who make devices that have encryption, we're going to force you to put in a backdoor so that if law enforcement asks for the data off the devices, you will have a way to give it to them. And of course, from the privacy side of things, I mean, huge uproar, right? You can't, the question is, so my second bullet there, the first hyphenated or the first italicized bullet, what are the security and privacy implications? And it almost gets down to which is more important. Is security more important, or is privacy more important? Or is that not even the right question, right? So, on the privacy side, you say, well, if you're going to provide privacy, you can't put in a backdoor. Well, if you want to provide security, you have to provide in a backdoor because you have to be able to provide law enforcement with this data, or they're not going to be able to secure people from future malicious acts that use encryption technologies to hide activities of malicious people. But then you get into some deeper questions about, this could only be applied to U.S. technologies, right? So this couldn't be required of companies in other countries who write software or who produce mobile devices that have encryption on them. So then the question is, if U.S. companies are forced to put backdoors into the encryption, then what's going to happen to the market value of those companies? And I think what you'd realize quickly is that nobody's going to buy a U.S. cell phone anymore if they know that there's a backdoor in the encryption, because they can't trust it to be private. And so those companies essentially go out of business. And maybe that's a good thing. I mean, and then another question is, so if the U.S. government says, hey, all you companies, you need to provide a backdoor so that we can get in, what happens if, do we share that backdoor with our allies? I think an ally could say, hey, we deserve to have that information as well. We should have the backdoor so that we can get in case somebody in Germany uses an iPhone and commits a crime and we want to trace their online activity, for example. And then, okay, so now we provide it to the U.S. government and we provide it to the allies of the U.S. government. What about our adversaries? What if Iran says, hey, we have crime too in our country and we want to trace back malicious activity on mobile devices, so we should get the backdoor so that we can use it on people in our country? And I don't know, you sort of go down this rabbit hole. I think it's an interesting discussion. I think, personal opinion is that the backdoor thing is a broken concept and it'll never fly. And again, it comes back to the fact that our digital economy is reliant on secure encryption systems, and any backdoor that you place in, eventually some malicious person is going to get a hold of it, and then once that Pandora's box is open, then you're pretty much out of luck after that. Okay, Edwardson, this is the last case study, I think. This is something, again, teachers will remember. 2013, Edward Snowden, a contractor working for the NSA, leaked classified information revealing numerous global surveillance programs run by the NSA and agencies in other governments. He fled to Moscow, where he remains. So he's now living in Moscow. And so here are questions. Were the government's actions violating citizens' right to privacy? So there are these, I mean, if you look at some of these documents, there was sort of this wide scale eavesdropping on cellular telephone calls, and these calls were being recorded and stored essentially, and not listened to. But the idea was we store all these phone calls from a certain subset of individuals, and then if there's some criminal activity that we suspect later on, then we can then we can go listen to those cell phone calls and see what they were talking about, for example. But I mean, there's definitely some things in the Edward Snowden files that privacy advocates would say, hey, this is a clear violation of privacy. And you know, the question, and I mean, that might even be interesting to sort of dig some of these documents up and see what was disclosed, because I think it won't be hard for you to show the students, hey, look, this kind of smells funny. You know, some of the data that was being captured by intelligence agencies in the U.S. And so the questions here: were the government's actions violating citizens' rights to privacy? You know, were Snowden's actions justified? So Snowden, he was a contractor. He wasn't an employee. He was simply a contractor working for an intelligence agency, and he, you know, basically smuggled these documents out and shared them with news media organizations. You know, was what he did justified? I mean, what other action could he have taken? Did he take some other action to try to express his concern with, you know, what he thought was an invasion of privacy? Did he do the right thing? And I put right in quotation marks there. And, you know, this is a thing where I think, you know, most students sort of quickly go down this path that they say, hey, you know, these things are egregious. You know, the intelligence agencies were eavesdropping on private interactions between individual citizens who were not suspected of committing any crime, and clearly a violation. Okay, but then if you put this in context and you think back to September 11th, right? What happened after September 11th? And again, that's, you know, the students aren't going to remember this, but the teachers probably will. You know, these intelligence agencies were, I mean, they were raked over the coals, right? They were told in no uncertain terms by the Congress of the United States that you better figure out a way to prevent something like this from happening again, right? The Congress said, hey, you know, September 11th, that should have been predicted by U.S. intelligence agencies. How could you not have seen this coming? How could this happen with the technology that's available to you at this day and age? And by God, you better figure out a way to stop it from happening again. And you know, so that's the context under which these different surveillance programs were created. And you know, even after the Snowden documents, you had a lot of lawmakers who sort of pointed to the Snowden documents and said, hey, you know, of course, this is a violation and the NSA should be ashamed. But really, you know, these are the same lawmakers who raked the NSA over the coals after September 11th. So, you know, that's the kind of thing that sort of gets both sides of the argument. And you know, this is the kind of a case study where you might, you know, assign it to groups of students and say, hey, you know, you know, this group take pro, this group take con, and we'll debate it, right? And talk about what we think is right and what we think is wrong. And so anyway, interesting case study, I think. Okay, so these are obviously much better if there's you know, if you have students in a room and you can sort of get this discussion going. And I would also suggest that maybe you look at some other, you know, so a lot of these are sort of politicized and maybe pretty deep for a bunch of high school kids. You might also look at some other technologies and think of the ethical implications, things like self-driving cars, for example. Make this a little bigger so you can see it. Self-driving cars, you might have a discussion about, you know, what are the implications, ethical and otherwise, from that. Drone technology, right? So now we have all these, you know, 10 years ago, drones were very much a hobby activity. In fact, you know, remote control aircraft have been a hobby activity for, you know, 100 years almost. But now anybody can go to Walmart and buy a drone for $50, and now they can be flying this thing with a camera on it around other people's homes. And so what, you know, how should they be regulated? Should they be regulated? You know, so interesting. And you know, then you get into air traffic issues, right? Now you have people flying them around airports. Where should they be able to fly them? Where should they not be able to fly them? You know, there's this legislation that says you have to have all of your drone aircraft that fly over a certain ceiling registered with the FAA. So now hobbyists are having to put markings on their aircraft and share, and register their aircraft with the FAA, so that if there's some problem, the FAA can go find them, and if the drone crashes in a place it shouldn't be, then they can be taken to task. 3D printers, I think, is an interesting thing to talk about. Obviously very cool technology, but what's the future of manufacturing if you can, as the 3D printer technology improves and you can basically make whatever you need at home. I mean, there are even 3D printers now that will print in different kinds of metal. So, now maybe you don't have to go buy car parts anymore. You just download the design and print it yourself. In fact, there are scanners who will scan things in 3D, and then you can take that scan and take it over to your 3D printer and print that thing out. And so that's kind of cool. So then you start to get into also, intellectual property discussions. Who owns the design for a physical object? And if somebody scans it and 3D prints it, is that a violation of intellectual property? There's also this discussion of, well, people can 3D print firearms. That's one you probably hear about a lot. People can 3D print firearms. Firearm probably isn't going to work very many times if you get it out of your 3D printer, but who knows? The technology may advance to the point where that's perfectly practical to print your own guns. And then so what are the laws surrounding that? Is the 3D model of a gun, is that now illegal to possess? There certainly has been legislation along those lines. So some interesting discussions there. Election hacking, and there are sort of a couple of different flavors of this, right? There are these influence operations. So what some people might call information warfare. And this is where you have things that were alleged during the 2016 elections, where you had these groups who were groups from foreign countries who were using Facebook and other online platforms to influence elections, using things like fake news and fake accounts and that kind of stuff. Where do we, what are the ethical and legal implications with regard to that? And then you also have like the like the hacking of the DNC mail servers, right? So you had this situation where Democratic National Committee had mail servers that were hacked, and you had emails that were taken and shared. And again, this all happened to the detriment of the Democratic Party. There's some things in some of those emails that were pretty inflammatory. And so, what is that espionage? If that was conducted by a U.S. national, what are the laws surrounding it? If that was conducted by somebody in another country, what are the laws surrounding that? What are the ethical implications of doing that kind of thing? This is purely information. It should be shared, right? Information should be free. We shouldn't be hiding our emails. So what are the ethics of it? Is that act justified to show that people are corrupt or untruthful or whatever? So anyway, just a few ideas. I think there are lots of interesting things that you could pull out and do these kinds of case studies. I think you could do one of these every week and have a great discussion every time, for 10 or 15 minutes. So lots of good stuff out there. Okay, I'm going to stop because I'm over my hour limit. So thanks for listening, and if anybody has any questions or comments, please feel free to shoot them our way. Otherwise, I look forward to talking to everybody next week. So thanks.